Now this video is going to focus on two of the four kinds of tissues that we have in our bodies. In the case of tissues, remember all cells come together to form tissues. And some of your tissues make up membranes, and that's a type of tissue called epithelial tissue. Other tissues are used in movement, which will be muscle tissue, communication, which will be nervous tissue, and then just kind of a leftover group, which is what we call connective tissue. Well, this video is just going to focus on muscle tissue and nervous tissue. And it's just a very brief explanation because when we talk about the muscular system, we're going to come back to muscle tissue in a lot more detail. Same when we talk about the nervous system, we'll come back to nervous tissue in a lot more detail. But if you have the newest edition of the Anatomy Coloring Book, page 11 discusses the three kinds of muscle tissue. Now remember, muscle tissue is made for movement. Now, in the case of muscle cells, a lot of times if I were to ask you to draw a picture of a cell, you would automatically draw a circle. Well, muscle cells are not circular. Remember, structure determines function. Muscle cells are a lot like an accordion, where you know those like flexible straws that have those bumps that you can stretch and then put back and stretch and back and forth, back and forth. So even though they are cells, muscle cells are called muscle fibers, because remember, structure determines function. And so the name is going to let you know it's not round. Well, like I said, page 11 of the Anatomy Coloring Book talks about the three kinds of muscle tissue you have. It has skeletal muscle, and then it says striated. It has cardiac muscle, and then it says striated. But it also has what's called visceral muscle, which is just commonly called smooth muscle. All muscles in your body will fall into one of these three categories. Now, in the case of skeletal muscle is what we call voluntary and striated. So I want to explain what that means. You have two major parts to your brain. The largest part of your brain is called your cerebrum, and it tends to control things that are involuntary, which means you don't have to think about them. They're automatic. You're just born knowing how to do it. And then you have a part of your brain called the cerebellum. The cerebellum controls voluntary movement. The cerebellum controls your skeletal muscles. Basically, you had to learn how to use these muscles. You had to learn how to roll over. You had to learn how to sit up. You had to learn how to hold something in your hand. You had to learn how to ride a bike. You get the idea. But with voluntary muscle, you had to learn how to use it. And skeletal muscle is voluntary. It's controlled by your cerebellum. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are involuntary, which means you have no conscious control over them whatsoever. Cardiac muscle obviously is in your heart. Well, you can't tell your heart when to beat. You don't have to tell your heart when to beat. It's involuntary. It just knows how to do it. And then you'll also see what's called striated and no striated. Well, muscle tissue is made from proteins. And when we get to muscle tissue, we're going to talk about those different proteins. We're going to talk about actin, we're going to talk about myosin. But with muscle tissue, the proteins have a very distinct pattern. Remember, structure determines function. All muscle tissue has the same distinct pattern. And this pattern is formed by the arrangement of proteins in muscle tissue. And you'll see later that this pattern is called a sarcomere. Well, sometimes in the case of the proteins that make up your muscle cells, the proteins are thick, and they're thick enough that you can see them. For example, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle has to be strong. It has to be thick. It's what holds your body together. It's what holds your bones together. It's what lets you stand up straight. Cardiac muscle obviously has to be thick and strong because it has to pump for your entire lives. So the proteins in skeletal and cardiac muscle, you can think of them as being thicker. So you can see stripes. So that's what it means to be striated. Smooth muscle is also called visceral muscle. Visceral is just a generic term that we use for your organs. Well, when we talk about a muscle is an organ. When we talk about the heart is an organ. So basically, smooth muscle is the muscle that makes up most of your other organs. And smooth muscle, it still has the same proteins, but yet smooth muscle doesn't have to be as thick. Smooth muscle doesn't have to be as strong. So you can think of it as those proteins don't have to be as thick. The proteins are still there, you just can't see them. So you can see the stripes, that's what it means to be striated, and in smooth muscle, you can't see the stripes. Now, muscles get their name based on where they're found in your body. Skeletal muscle gets its name because it attaches to your skeleton. So like when you physically move, like you walk, you talk, you raise your hand, the skeletal muscle is doing that. Cardiac muscle gets its name because it's found in the heart, and it's found only in the heart. Cardiac muscle pumps. Smooth muscle is found in your hollow organs. So cardiac muscle would be in your heart, but smooth muscle would be in your blood vessels. Your heart beats, your blood vessels pulse. And all smooth muscle pulses, because most smooth muscle is found in organs that are hollow, so you're having to push things through. So when we talk about smooth muscle, you're often going to see the word peristalsis. 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 Peristalsis means to pulse. All smooth muscle does that, and that's to help push whatever it is through the hollow organ, with the exception of cardiac muscle, which is in the heart. Now, in the case of smooth muscles, like I said, we're going to come back to these when we do the muscular system. Because every time you talk about a muscle, like your pectoral muscle, or your biceps, or your triceps, you're actually talking about an organ. And when you name those muscles, you're talking about skeletal muscle. So here's a photo of the skeletal muscle, and here's the artist's drawing. Now, in the case of the skeletal muscle, you can see it's not a circle. It's long and skinny. That's why we don't really call them muscle cells. We call them muscle fibers. And you can see how they have a dense cellularity. These cells are tightly packed together. And that's to give your muscles strength. I mean, these muscles are holding you up. You can also see the stripes. That's what it means to be striated. And skeletal muscle is actually so long that it has to be multinucleated. Skeletal muscle fibers are so long, one nucleus cannot keep up with the demand for all the proteins that muscle needs. So when we get to the muscle unit, we'll talk about all the different types of skeletal muscle. Now, you then have smooth muscle. If you'll notice with smooth muscle, it has a looser cellularity. It's not as tightly packed. It doesn't have to be, because you don't have to rely on strength with your smooth muscle. But smooth muscle makes up most of your hollow organs. So your blood vessels, your intestines, your ureter, your urethra, the tubes that deal with your excretory system. And these guys are responsible for propulsion. That's an idea that we call peristalsis. So when we actually start talking about hollow organs like the stomach, we'll come back to smooth muscle. And remember, smooth muscle gets its name because you don't see those stripes. And then last but not least is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is striped, it is striated, and cardiac muscle is found only in the heart. Now if you look at the drawing, you'll see the striations, but then you'll see some pretty dark lines. So here you see those pretty dark lines. Those are not striations. Cardiac muscle is very different from skeletal muscle. Notice with skeletal muscle, it's just like having a pile of straws. Well, cardiac muscle, there's a little bit more space in between those cells. And in the case of skeletal muscle, the cells are really long. It's like an accordion. They can expand, they can flex, they can contract, they can relax. In the case of your cardiac muscle, the cardiac muscle are actually a bunch of little cells that connect together to look like one big cell. So in this picture here, that's one cell there. This is another cell. This is another cell. That's one cell there. That's another cell. That's another cell. So cardiac muscle looks like long cells, but it's actually a bunch of cells that are joined together. So these dark lines you see here are the junction points. Well, if you look at page 11 of the anatomy coloring book, when it talks about cardiac muscle, you'll see what's called intercalated disc. The intercalated disc is the name we give these junctions, and we'll talk more about that when we do cardiac muscle. But if you'll also notice, cardiac muscle is branched. Those branches are called anastomes. Ana, like the name, A-N-A, and then stome, S-T-O-M-E-S. Stome means opening. Well, think of your heart as a trampoline. You've got this huge trampoline in your backyard, and it sits high off the ground. And you know you can get some pretty good bounces. But then they have like those little trampolines that a lot of people exercise with. They're not that very far off the ground, and you're not going to get a lot of bounce. Well, anastomes basically give your heart muscle room to bounce. Because your heart has to beat every second of every day, you need room. Your heart has to bounce. So you need some space between the trampoline and the ground, basically, to let that happen. But when we do cardiac muscle, we're going to come back to that in a lot more detail. But again, if you look at page 11, you'll see skeletal muscle, and you'll see how it's tightly packed together. You'll see cardiac muscle, you'll see it's part of the heart, and you'll see the stripes on both of those. And then there's smooth muscle, and it uses it as an example of your intestines. But when we talk about muscle system, when we talk about like your muscular system, we're going to be talking about skeletal muscle. And when we do the different organs, we'll come back to smooth muscle. And when we do the heart, we'll come back to cardiac muscle. The next thing I want to look at is nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is talked about on page 13 in your coloring book. Nervous tissue is in your body to allow you to communicate. Now, nervous tissue basically allows you to make electricity. You're a light bulb. Well, notice this is a nerve cell. This is not round. And you guys know the root word for nerve is neuro. Well, we do not call nerve cells neurocytes. Because again, when you see the term cyte, you think of a cell that's round. So the root word for muscle, I forgot to mention, the root word for muscle is myo, M-Y-O. So even though a muscle cell, we don't call it a myocyte, we call it a myofibril, because it's a fiber. But this guy here is what we call a neuron. And nervous tissue, remember, are groups of cells that work together. And when we talk about nervous tissue, you're going to have the cells that make electricity and then the cells that help the cells that make electricity. So on page 13 in your coloring book, you'll see where it talks about the neuron. The neuron is the cell that actually makes the electricity. And then you'll see these things called neuroglial cells. Neuroglial cells are part of the tissue. They just don't make electricity. And we'll get into more detail with that later on. But since these are tissues, we need to talk about them. So the main job of nervous tissue is basically to conduct electrical impulses. You create electricity. And that's how your brain basically talks to the parts of your body. Well, to be a tissue, you have a group of cells that work together. Well, in nervous tissue, you have two groups of cells. And on page 13 in your anatomy coloring book, you'll see what's called the neuron. Neuron. This is a neuron. The neuron is the cells in the nervous tissue that actually create the electricity. And whenever you see impulses, an impulse is an electrical current. So notice this looks a lot like a plug in your house. This would be the appliance. This is the plug that comes off of it. And you guys know that plugs end, with the metal thing sticking out, very much like that. Well, structure determines function. This guy's going to work very different. And if you'll notice in your coloring book, it talks about this thing called a dendrite. this thing called an axon, and this thing called a cell body. Well, what you think of as the cell or the nucleus is, that's going to be called the cell body. And if you'll notice, it has all these branches coming off of it. Well, all these branches up here are these things called dendrites. And you're going to see the job of the dendrite is to absorb information. So right now, you're actually seeing this video. So light is hitting the neurons of your eyes. Well, the light, basically what is it doing? As these guys absorb light, they're heating up. And when they heat up enough, they create electricity. Thus, you're going to see what we call threshold. Every neuron has a threshold. It's basically, what does it take to turn it on? So it's like you flipping a light switch. You have to flip it all the way up to get it to create the electricity. Well, in the case of your eyes, all these dendrites have to heat up enough that they reach threshold, they turn on, and they create electricity. They then send all that information to the cell body. And the cell body's job is to figure out what's important and what's not. And then all the important stuff gets sent down the long cord, and that long cord is called the axon. And then down here, you would have other cells waiting to get that information. Well, the neuron actually creates the electricity, but there's other cells that help make up nerves as well. When we talk about a nerve is an organ. And remember, an organ is a group of cells that work together. So when we talk about a nerve, it has nervous tissue. It also has epithelial tissue because it's an organ. It's going to have a membrane around it. It also has blood vessels going to it. That's connective tissue. But in the case of nervous tissue, groups of cells that work together, you have the neurons, which actually make the electricity, and then you have these things called neuroglial. They're also called your supporting cells, and they're not going to make electricity, but they're going to help the neuron in some way. So in your coloring book, you'll see where it talks about these things called oligodendrocytes, these things called astrocytes. These guys are going to help the neuron do their job, but they're not themselves aren't going to create the electricity. Oops, sorry. So this is a picture, a drawing of a neuron. Again, there's the cell body. Here are your dendrites. Okay? And just like a cord from an appliance, your axon is insulated. And so that insulated, we'll talk about that later, that insulation is made from fat, and that fat's called myelin. And then you have these things called Schwann cells. Schwann cells would be an example of a neuroglial cell. Without this layer of fat, without the insulation, your nerve would short circuit. So what you're seeing here, here's a cell body. These are all the dendrites coming off of it, and this guy right here is the axon. All those little black dots are probably cells or dirt particles that got trapped. Oops, next one. So that is muscle tissue and nervous tissue.